Hi, this is Dr. Buchanan. Today I want to talk about military defiance of civilians. I want to talk about the Admirals Revolt against President Truman. That occurred between 1945 and 1950. Why is that relevant to today? Well, there's an admiral by the name of Gilday, an officer and a gentleman of about my height, 5'6", who has reinstated Captain Crozier, the gentleman who was thrown off by Secretary of Defense Mike Esper and the Secretary of the Navy, as well as the White House, for having written 20 or 25 letters stating that his naval officers had coronavirus on board the Roosevelt. In defiance of that, Admiral Gilday is saying, I'm reinstating Crozier into the Navy, defying the President and the Secretary of Defense. However, this recalls a very famous incident for me about admirals, some of whom I had known about. In 1945, Curtis LeMay, who had developed an incredible Air Force and strategic bombing, he and McNamara developed what was called saturation bombing, going from 35,000 feet to 10,000 feet. He came back to President Truman and said, we do not need a Navy anymore. I do not need aircraft carriers. I do not need destroyers. Basically, I have a strategic air command that can do what the Navy did. Truman agreed, as did Secretary of Defense George Marshall and Omar Bradley. All three have said, we don't need this big a Navy. I have a $100 billion GDP, and 41% of that is going to the military, and the Navy has to cut down the number of aircraft carriers and destroyers. 20 to 30 admirals resigned in protest, as well as other naval officers who said that is not going to happen. We need a Navy, and we're not going to follow the orders. In turn, James Forrestal, who was Secretary of the Navy and a man who loved the Navy, defied President Truman's orders. In response, President Truman fired James Forrestal. What happened to him is a sad story. He went to Bethesda Naval Hospital for mental breakdown and unfortunately committed suicide by jumping off that hospital. In turn, what happened is the Navy hid many of their vessels and their aircraft carriers and defied any orders from the White House or from General Marshall. In turn, what eventually happened as the revolt of the admirals, one of whom I knew very well, an admiral by the name of Wick Toole, who was the stenographer, the writer, and the historian for this event, and unfortunately died recently, he told me that as a result of the admirals' defiance and revolt, we had a Navy that was prepared to go to war when the invasion of North Korea occurred into South Korea. In 1950, lo and behold, a few weeks after the defiance of the admirals' revolt, North Korea had invaded South Korea, and we decided to implement what was called an amphibious landing under General MacArthur into North Korea. So what is the lesson here? Often in times of crisis, in times of war, the military has to defy the civilians. How do I know? Because I have often defied President Carter and other presidents under whom I served, and at that time I was in the military. In the words of Pogo, the famous cartoon character, I have seen the enemy, and he is us. Thank you and good luck.